Well, thank you very much indeed for your warm welcome, and thank you so much for coming along this evening. I'm grateful to the principal and I'm grateful to the elders of the church for making this possible, and it's a delight to have a little time to talk with you about something I'm really passionate about, and that is how we understand our God, how we celebrate God as creator and redeemer, and use the lenses of the Bible and science to help us to do that. Of course, we live in a culture where many people say that's the wrong starting point. They'll say you can look at the universe through the lens of science and that's all you need. Or you look at the Bible using that as a lens and that's all you need. For me, the biblical faith, embodied supremely in our Lord Jesus Christ, says that science is a gift to be used under the gift of God's word, to allow us to be excited by who God is. Kepler once said that science is thinking God's thoughts after him. And part of this evening for me is just to explore that with you. But I am conscious that in the culture that we live in various parts of the world today, many people immediately set up a conflict between science and faith, between science and the Bible. O'Brien is a very clever comedian, but his view of faith is based on New Atheism, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they're often called: Dawkins, Dennett, Hitchens, and Sam Harris, and the opposition of science and faith. And you notice how O'Brien characterises Christian belief in simplistic ways. That's the culture that I, as a Christian, exist in and live in. It's there in comedy, and it's there in the best-selling works of the New Atheists. But I want to say that tonight, I think the scriptural understanding of God as creator responds not just to New Atheism, but goes beyond New Atheism, in actually giving us resources to engage with science at a much deeper and exciting level. I've told the story once or twice. A number of years ago I was on a train from Durham, where I live, to London, and the person beside me introduced themselves and said, "What do you do?" Well, I said, "I'm a Methodist minister, I teach theology." I'm always a little worried about saying that to people, because you never quite know what people's reaction will be. And this man's eyes seemed to fill with fear, as he thought to himself, "Oh no, all the way to London sitting beside a religious fanatic." So he quickly tried to change the topic of conversation. He said, "What did you do before that?" I said, "I did research in theoretical astrophysics." This time his eyes glazed, as he thought it was something to do with science, but he wasn't too sure. And then he asked me the question, how can you be a scientist and a Christian? Sure, what I want to testify to this evening is that you can be a scientist and a Christian. There are difficult questions, and we'll get to those in the question time. But my own experience in being a scientist and a Christian is that my excitement with the scriptures has been deepened, broadened, energized. And my excitement with science has been broadened, deepened, energized. Now, to look at how the scriptures talk about God as creator, we could have gone to very many places, couldn't we? Genesis, yes. But don't forget that a great deal about God as creator is in the wisdom literature, particularly in Proverbs, in prophets, 2nd Isaiah, those wonderful passages of creation if you've read your Bible. In the Psalms, and then don't forget that actually very central to the New Testament understanding is the way that God the Creator and Jesus are one. In John chapter 1, in Colossians chapter 1, in Hebrews chapter 1, God as Creator is even in Revelation, where we also think about the end of the universe. But tonight, following the words of that great prophet Julie Andrews, let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. Then let's go back to Genesis chapter 1. And I'm conscious in doing this that this isn't an easy task. Because within the Christian community, there's a degree of controversy on how you interpret Genesis 1. And sometimes, in some places, I feel a little like this. I want to tell you which side of the divide I'm on this. Now, I'm going to come to some of the controversy in a moment, but just initially, I want to say one or two things. But first, it seems to me, as Christians who sometimes disagree on Genesis 1, we should come to this with a degree of humility. Christians actually have disagreed about these things for over 100 years. And therefore, we should be careful not to think our particular view, my particular view, is the last word on the matter. Secondly, I want to make the point that whatever we believe about the authority of the Bible can't necessarily bring with it a certain interpretation of the Bible. We may all live under God's word and see it as authoritative in all matters of faith and conduct, but we can disagree about how we interpret various passages. And the third is that sometimes in the controversy within the Christian church on Genesis 1, we miss some of the really big themes that are there. I live right beside an 11th century cathedral called Durham Cathedral. I remember going into it as a child on a school trip where you're given a clipboard and a piece of paper and they tell you to find out who was buried at what date, and you've got to fill in each of the boxes if you've done that sort of thing at school. And I went into Durham Cathedral and I looked all around the walls looking, and my friend suddenly nudged me and said, "Look up." And I looked up and found this amazing Norman ceiling, beautiful arches across the top. And sometimes in the controversy that we've had as Christians, we've missed the big themes of Genesis 1. Themes that begin in Genesis but span right through the scriptures. And I'm going to, first of all, as you'll see on the handout, going to pick out a number of those big themes and see how they relate to science. Is that all right with everyone? I hope it is, because that's what I've prepared, so if it's not, we'll have to think about something else. But that's what I'm going to do. And we'll see how we go on this and how time takes us. So let's begin. And my suggestion to you is that these themes are not just there in Genesis 1, but within Christian tradition, whether you look at Martin Luther or John Calvin, you see these same themes as coming out in their understanding of God as creator. The first is this: God is the sole creator of the universe. Verse 1, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. God is without peer and competitor. He is the sole creator of the universe. Now you may be sitting there thinking to yourself, why has this chap come all the way from England to tell us that God is the sole creator of the universe? That's obvious, isn't it? You just have to read the first verse of the Bible to know that. Well, it is obvious, but it is so important that the writer will return to it a number of times in order to say, I want you to understand how important this is. Look, for example, not verse 1, but verse 16. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. Greater light, lesser light. What's the writer talking about there as the greater light and the lesser light? What's he talking about? Very easy. Sun and moon. But why not use the words sun and moon? Well, if you know anything about the ancient Near East, you'll know that the sun and the moon in certain ancient Near Eastern thought were seen as gods. What the writer is doing here is something called theological polemic. Or, don't be so silly as to believe that the sun and the moon are gods. He simply calls them the greater light and the lesser light, because they're all made by the one true God. Or Well, look at verse 21. God created the great sea monsters. Now that word create is a very special word in Hebrew. It's used in verse 1, God created the heavens and the earth. It's used in verse 27, God created human beings in his image. And then it's used the only third time here in verse 21. God created the great sea creatures. And you think to yourself, I can understand why this special word is used for the whole universe. I understand why this special word is used for human beings, but why is it used for the great sea creatures? Does God have a particular interest in whales? Is Free Willy his favourite series of movies? Or something like that? I mean, why? Well, again, if you know anything about the ancient Near East, you know that in some stories of creation, God has to overcome the great creatures of the sea before he creates. The writer of Genesis is saying, don't think that this God has to overcome something that's already there. Even if these great sea creatures exist, they're all created by the one true God. Do you get the picture of what's going on? God is without peer or competitor. He is absolute in creation. And if we had time, and you've got it on the handout, we might talk about how in certain stories of creation, God struggles to separate. Here in Genesis, he just separates easily. That in Egyptian stories, God has magical utterances by which to create. Here, God just says, and it is so. And one of the great understatements of Genesis 1, one of my favourites, verse 16, God made the stars also. You ever noticed that? Oh, by the way, God made the stars also. Do you know how many stars there are in the universe? Well, our sun is one star, and it's one of 100 billion stars in the galaxy. And our galaxy, the Milky Way, is only one of 100 billion galaxies in the universe. Now, I know it's late on a Thursday evening, but how many stars are there in the universe? Very simple. You multiply 100 billion by 100 billion, and the answer is a lot. I mean, that's something like the grains of sand on the beaches of the world. This God, by the way, he's so great. He created the 100 billion stars and 100 billion galaxies because he is so great. God is the sole creator of the universe. Now you'll say, okay, let's play with that. How does that theme play with modern science? Well, modern science gives us a very different picture in terms of the origin of the universe, you might say. It's a model called the Big Bang, and this model of the Big Bang says that at the moment we're about 13.7 or 13.8 billion years old, and in our present understanding of physics, we think we can draw the history of the universe back in time. In fact, we think we know what the universe was like when it was only 1 million years old. In fact, we think we know what the universe was like when it was only 1 second old. This isn't to scale, by the way. In fact, we think we know the universe pretty much what we think it was like when it was 10 to the minus 43 of a second old. Now, if you're not a mathematician, that's 1 divided by 10 followed by 42 zeroths of a second. It's a very, very small fraction of a second. And physicists are reasonably confident that the evidence that we look at and the models that we create to try and explain that evidence gives a pretty good picture of a universe that starts very small and expands rapidly. Quarks appear, then hydrogen and helium appears between 1 and 1,000 seconds, and then, to cut a long story short, stars and galaxies collapse out of vast clouds of molecular hydrogen. Now, let me be clear on this. Cosmology is not proof. Cosmology is a bit like a detective story. When Miss Marple comes onto the scene of a crime, she hasn't seen the crime happen. This great elderly female detective has to look at the clues and pieces of evidence and try and reconstruct what actually happened to the best of her ability. Cosmologists are like that when it comes to this picture. And the evidence has accumulated over the last century. But even with that picture, there's an interesting part of this. That is that our current laws of physics break down at 10 to the minus 43 of a second. We can't go any further. It's very frustrating to physicists, and the reason for that is because these two great theories of 20th century physics, general relativity and quantum theory, don't fit together. We haven't got time this evening to explain general relativity and quantum theory in great detail. Although if you want to come back in the question time, feel free to do that. I think you'll just have to trust me at the moment. These two theories don't come together. And that's really frustrating. A number of years ago, Robert Jastrow summed this up in a famous quote. He talked about how scientists have got so far in explaining the universe, but can't get any further. And he wrote, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He's scaled the mountains of ignorance, he's about to conquer the highest peak, and as he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries." Now, is Jastrow right? Is our biblical God the one who fills in the question mark? Is that what the Bible means by God as the sole creator of the universe? In fact, a number of Christians have argued it. Pius XII in the 1960s argued it, and an Oxford cosmologist called E.A. Milne, and quotes are on your handouts. Milne wrote a great book on general relativity, on the expansion of the universe, and finished the book by saying, the story of the universe is incomplete without him, God. Now, is that the biblical understanding of a creator God? My bold suggestion to you is no, it's not. For this is a God of the gaps. Many people have tried to prove God with this type of argument. If science breaks down what causes the universe, that must be God. The problems with the logic with that, but more importantly, theologically, there are two problems. The first is what Charles Coulson called a God of the gaps, and he said, beware if science has a little gap in it, of inserting God as the explanation into that gap. Because as science increasingly explains more and more of its own territory, so God is pushed out of the gap and becomes irrelevant. The God who's described in Genesis is not a God who pokes around in the little gaps of the universe. Second problem is the problem of deism. Now, the deists believed in a God who started off the universe and then went off for a cup of tea, not to have anything more to do with it. A God who stands back from creation once it started off. Is that the biblical God? My answer is no, it's not. For the God who creates the universe is the God who sustains the universe moment by moment. That's why you get these New Testament pictures, like in Hebrews 1. He upholds the universe by his word of power. Or was that me? Or in Colossians. Do you remember Colossians? As Paul describes Jesus and says, in him all things hold together, all things cohere. God is not a God who builds the ship of the universe, smashes a champagne bottle against its hull, and pushes it out to sea, saying, cheerio, folks, see you on Judgment Day. God is the one who keeps the whole universe afloat, moment by moment. You see, when we talk about God as the sole creator of the universe, We're not talking about a God who simply starts the button and then has nothing more to do with it. This is a God who sustains every moment of the universe's history. And if you've read Stephen Hawking, what Hawking is attempting to do is to explain that first 10 to the minus 43 a second. What he attempts to do is give a scientific description of that very first moment of the universe's history. Now, at the moment, in my estimation, is not successful. However, I'm not worried about the possibility that he might do that. Because for me, that's simply filling in a little bit more of the story of creation. God is much bigger than having to be proved through gaps. He's much bigger than a deistic creator. He's the one who holds the whole universe. And in response to Professor Hawking, I think there is a question. Because if Hawking says it's quantum theory which gives birth to a universe, I think the Christian, or indeed any other philosopher, can rightly say to the scientist, but where does quantum theory itself come from? Where do the laws of physics come from? For science assumes that the laws are there. It doesn't explain why they're there. And so, although science may be successful in lots of ways, the biblical account says that the sole ground of being of the universe, the sole reason for its existence, the sole existence of the physical laws, why they came into being in the beginning and why they continue to be the case, is because of this sole creator of the universe. Now that is a battle with new atheism. That is a strong conversation that Christians need to have, to say there's more to the universe than just this story that you want to describe. But I want Christians to be engaged in that. Where do the laws of physics come from? And what is the purpose or meaning of the universe? To use an old illustration, science can explain a great deal. For instance, in scientific terms, what is a kiss? Well, a kiss is the approach of two pairs of lips, the reciprocal transmission of carbon dioxide and microbes, and the juxtaposition of two orbicular muscles in a state of contraction. That is a kiss in scientific terms. But if I go to my wife Alison at the end of this trip and say to her, Alison, let me get together with you for a mutual transmission of carbon dioxide and microbes. Let me juxtapose my orbicular muscle in a state of contraction with yours. She would say, get lost. You see, in that context with my wife, I want to talk about a kiss in terms of meaning, value, purpose. Which is the true definition of a kiss? The carbon dioxide or the meaning, value and purpose? Actually, both are true. And to fully understand what a kiss is about, you need both. Where the laws of physics come from, what's the meaning or value, purpose of the universe? Those are not explained by Hawking. And he actually acknowledges that in a number of writings. Let's go back to Genesis. Second, God is the sustainer of order in the universe. And I've touched on this already. One of the amazing things about Genesis 1 is the way that order runs through this particular passage. So for instance, it starts off with this key verse. The earth was shapeless and empty, as the index verse for the chapter. Day 1, day 2, day 3 are about the giving of shape to the universe, the separation of things. Day 4, day 5, day 6 are about the filling up of that shape. You see, from emptiness to filling up. Day 7, the whole thing comes back together, and the heavens and the earth were finished, and God rested. It's a beautiful pattern to Genesis. And then, of course, you start looking at it in Hebrew, and you see certain things, that the word God appears 35 times, the word firmament 21 times, the phrase repeated, it was good 7 times. You don't need to be a great mathematician to know that they're all divisible by 7. And the number 7 to the Hebrew is that which speaks of order and perfection. And so, as you encounter this passage, You're encountering a passage which is talking about a God of order. That's been very, very important for the growth of modern science. That theological view. Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss and other of the new atheists often pose the question. They say, what has theology ever done for us? And one of the responses, ironically, is it's given us the science by which you've made a living and now are trying to use it to attack God. Because that fundamental belief in the order of the universe was one of the reasons why modern science itself grew. There's a second reason. And this comes with this man, Galileo. There he is, pointing his telescope at the skies. And a very simplistic retelling of the Galileo incident puts Galileo against the church, Galileo against the Bible. It's far more interesting, far more complex than that. Galileo, of course, was a fully committed Christian. He saw his work as thinking God's thoughts after him, just as Kepler did. But one of the interesting things about Galileo is why he did this in the first place. Why did he actually point the telescope at the heavens? Now you might say, well, that's how you do science, isn't it? Collect data. It wasn't always the case. If you were shaped by Greek science, then you would look for patterns or logic in the world and in the universe. That's why Aristotle, because he believed in the sphere being the perfect shape for the universe, built a universe with the Earth at the centre and all of the planets and stars on crystalline spheres going around it. It was a logical system. But Galileo and others said, just hold on a moment, they said. What if the God that we see in Genesis isn't bound by human logic? What if God is free to create, the sole creator of the universe? He can create it in human logic terms or in non-human logic terms. How are we going to find out what the universe is like? The only way we're going to find out what the universe is like is if we look at the universe. Look to see what God has done. This is the basis of empirical science, of modern science, as we call it. The theological conviction that made Galileo spend his nights looking at the moons of Jupiter, noting them here in his notebook, and saying, as I look at the universe, I'm getting a clue to how God has made it. Science for Galileo and others is a profoundly Christian thing. And in fact, again, we've got about 4 hours tonight, haven't we? No, we haven't. If we had a little longer, we could develop this as historians of science have pointed out, that Christianity wasn't the only influence upon science, but it was a major influence upon science. Because the universe was created, you had to look at it to find out what God had done. Because God was a God of order, there should be laws. Because we're made in the image of God, we had optimism that we could understand that order. Because there was only one God, those laws would be universal and consistent across the universe. It wasn't under a regime of lots of different gods. Because there was no fear of the gods of nature in the Judeo-Christian understanding, you could do experiments. Some people have even taken it further and said that the Judeo-Christian celebration of the materiality of the universe meant that, unlike the Greek philosophers, you could get your hands dirty in doing experiments, in finding out what the universe was like. I think this is really important. I think it's really important as a message to those outside the church, but it's equally an important message to those inside the church. God is the sustainer of order. And that means that a Christian can be called as much to be a physicist as to being a priest. I'm sure this church and the churches you come from don't make this kind of mistake, but sometimes I go to churches where there seems to be a hierarchy of Christian callings. Do you know what I mean? The most holy people are the missionaries. And you come down a little bit in holiness, and you get the pastors. You come down a little bit more in holiness, and you get the theological teachers. Then you come down a little bit more in holiness, and you get those who work in the caring professions. And right at the bottom of the heap are often the scientists and the accountants. No, says the Bible. The whole reason that we can do science is because God is a God of order. He's created the universe for us to look at and to see. And therefore, if you're studying chemistry or biology, if you're an engineer, if you teach in a high school in science, you are doing Christian ministry. Because at the heart of creation is a God who gives us the gift of science. And sometimes for young people, if they say, the Lord wants me to go overseas on a mission, we bring them to the front of the church, we pray with them, lay on hands, we give them a big check to help them financially, we celebrate. I wonder if a young person says, the Lord has called me to study chemistry. Whether we're prepared to do the same thing, bring them to the front, lay on hands, give them a big check, send them out, celebrate. It's as much a Christian ministry, which we should celebrate. God is a God of order. Third thing, let's go back to the book. God is a source of extravagance. Now you might be sitting there thinking, God is a God of order. That sounds physics and mathematics and that sort of thing, engineering. And you might have had the experience of encountering physicists and mathematicians who are just slightly boring. There are one or two from time to time. And you might get this sense that God is a bit of a boring physics teacher. Well, there's another side to the Genesis account, and that is God as the divine artist who just loves to create. Oh, sorry, let me go back to this. This is one of my favourite galaxies. UDFJ 395462884. Astronomers have great imagination in naming their galaxies from time to time. I love this galaxy. I'll tell you why. It's not special in terms of its size. It's quite small. It's about 1,000,000 times, 1,000 times smaller than the Milky Way, but it's taken in a photograph here by the Hubble Space Telescope, which has gazed at this little box for a long time and found this little galaxy here. The exciting thing about this is that the light from this galaxy has taken 13.2 billion years to reach us. 13.2 billion years to reach us. The light from the sun takes about 8 minutes to reach the surface of the Earth. The light from this galaxy has taken 13.2 billion years. Do you remember Psalm 19? The heavens declare the glory of God. Psalm 8, when I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, God's so great that he creates this vast universe over billions of light years just with his fingers. And God makes 100 billion stars in each of 100 billion galaxies. And some people ask me, why does God create so many stars? I mean, if he wanted just to be in a relationship with human beings, he could have one sun and one planet. Why create so many stars? Well, the obvious answer is he wants people to do PhDs in astrophysics. But apart from that, God just loves to create. The God of Scripture just loves extravagance. And so you get this in Genesis 1, and if you notice in church, if you preach on Genesis 1, rarely do people actually read the whole of Genesis 1. Why? Because it takes so long. Because the writer gets just so thrilled at all of the different kinds in creation, all of the extravagance in creation, including all of the stars. And what does this mean? Well, again, I think it says to us as Christians that actually science is fun. Some of you will have not experienced science as fun. Some of you will not experience science as fun just at the moment. And in fact, a great deal of science isn't fun at all. Those of you who are scientists will know that a great deal of science is tedious, it's boring, it's frustrating, it's about experiments that don't work, It's about people who don't give you the money to do experiments that you want. It's about people who read your paper for a journal, who don't see the brilliance of your argument. It's about research students who won't do what you tell them to do. But there are, through all of that, moments of awe, of going, wow, gosh, isn't that incredible? And for the Christian, the ability to go on from that awe and say, wow, gosh, Lord, aren't you incredible? I stand in awe in your presence. In fact, these words are above the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, where Rutherford split the atom. And just in case you don't do the Latin, great are the works of the Lord, they're pondered by all who delight in them. I don't think we should see science as a threat or be fearful of it. Great are the works of the Lord. Let's delight in them. Sure, we want to say to people who want to use scientism to rule out God, no, that's not good enough. But we shouldn't ourselves be fearful of science. We should delight in it and get this sense of an extravagant God. Kepler, when he saw that the elliptical orbits worked, talked about the rapture that he found in just that experience, the delight of science. And what does it mean for us in our worship, in our preaching, to encounter this extravagant God? A friend of mine once defined grace as extravagant generosity. I like that. God has an extravagance about him. Fourth, are you all still with me, by the way? Is this all right so far? Hope so. Fourth, let's go back to the text. And that is, God is the seeker of relationship. Verse 27. God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female, he created them. Now, within the Christian church, these verses are used a great deal, and sometimes we don't see their significance. But if you contrast them with some of the Babylonian stories of creation, they are in stark contrast. In Enuma Elish, one of the Babylonian stories in the Old Testament, the human beings are created as the servants of gods. They're there to get them something to drink and something to eat. A kind of divine Downton Abbey. Has Downton Abbey made it here at all? Yes. So the human beings are the servants downstairs, the gods are there in their finery. All that human beings have to do is provide food and drink to the gods. That's what they're created for. What a difference in the Genesis account, isn't it? Created in the image of God. Extraordinary. Well, what does that mean? Well, I think it means one of two things. The image of God is a lecture series in itself, of course. But let me pick out one or two key things for me. The first is that I think involved in this sense of image is the gift of relationship. A gift of intimate relationship. And the writer of Genesis 2 and 3 will develop this in terms of God walking in the garden, of God speaking directly to Adam and Eve. There is an intimacy of relationship that's given to human beings. Second, there's a responsibility given in this image, a responsibility of stewardship for the earth, a gift of responsibility. And there's a gift of creativity, I think. That being made in the image of a creative God is the potential and the responsibility to be creative. All of this, of course, is done not as just individuals, but as a community together. That excites me. In a world of science where the question of what it means to be human is more and more the central question of modern science. What will it mean if my computer develops some kind of consciousness and I need to ask it before switching it off whether I can switch it off or not? People are asking those questions. What will it mean if parts of my body are replaced through machines, transhumanism? How much of me remains me? What's the significance of that I share so much of my DNA with a cauliflower? What makes, you can probably tell by looking at me, what makes me different from the rest of the created order? What about this relationship between mind and brain as neuroscience develops? What about life elsewhere in the universe? If it exists, what makes us special as human beings? These are all questions that I think the biblical account of what it means to be human can come and speak into each of those areas. Don't get me wrong. It doesn't come and say, I'll tell you what the answer is, da-da-da-da. It comes and says, this is the framework that we as Christians believe lies at the core of what it means to be human, that distinguishes us from the rest of creation. And how does that work out? Or why do I believe that? Well, remember I said that creation runs through Scripture and then runs right through the New Testament. And I want to make a plea, even though I've concentrated on Genesis 1 this evening, that we hold together Genesis 1 with the rest of the Bible. Too often we've separated it. And we've separated it by not reading it in the context of the rest of the Bible. And sometimes actually we've approached evangelism wanting to try and prove God through science without forgetting that at the heart of Christian faith is that the Creator becomes a human being and lives amongst us in Jesus. I showed you the statue of the Redeemer there because I remember being in a little church in Rio. It probably was not as big as this stage, and there were about 40 of us in there. It was in a favela, one of the very poorest parts of Rio. And there was no musical instruments apart from a set of drums. So the whole service was just drums. And it was in Portuguese, and I don't speak Portuguese. 3 hours the service lasted. It was just tremendous. During one of the songs, people started to stand up and point at each other while they sang. And if you're ever in a foreign country and don't speak the language and people start pointing at you, it's very disturbing. And so afterwards I said to them, tell me what was that song about? And she stood up and started to point at each other and point at me. And they said, oh, it's a very simple chorus. They said, it's one of our favourites. It's very simple. It goes, you are special, you are created, you are loved by God. You are special, you are created, you are loved by God. And as they told the rest of their story over a lunch which only us visitors ate, by the way, they told about how difficult it was to be a human being in a favela in Rio. The fact that one of their young people had been killed by a stray bullet due to drug-related violence the previous week. How it was difficult to eke out a living. How they felt so dispossessed looking at the rich parts of Rio. But in their Christian faith, because of their understanding of who the Creator God was, they knew that they were created, they were loved, they were special by God. And the reason for that is Jesus. And so in the New Testament, John begins his Gospel with this wonderful prologue to his story of Jesus. And in it he does some great philosophy. He begins by a philosophical synthesis of Hebrew thought and Greek thought. He takes the logos, the word, the Greek understanding of the rationality behind the universe, And he puts it together with the Hebrew understanding of the Word, which is God's personal creative activity. That's why in Genesis, God said, and it was created. And John does this wonderful thing of putting the two together and says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And you sit there thinking, wow, what a wonderful thing to think about, John. That the scientific rationality of the universe is the same thing as God's personal creative activity. Tremendous. But then John comes with something even more profound. Something actually quite unbelievable in many ways. And he writes, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. We beheld his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father. No one has ever seen God. The only Son, he has made him known. See, this God of creation cannot be known simply through science. This God of creation is known because, supremely, he enters our world in Jesus. And through his death and resurrection, he opens up the way for us to be reconciled back into the relationship that he wants with each one of us. That's the most extraordinary truth of the gospel. So let me go on then. I got carried away by these big themes in Genesis 1. God is sole creator, God is sustainer of order, God is the source of extravagance, the seeker of relationship. And you can see my passion and excitement about them. Let me return to what I started with. And that was that Genesis 1 has led to different interpretations of evangelical Christians over the years. And let me just try and chart those for you in terms of the options that are there for Bible-believing Christians. And I've chosen 5. All of which have come or were around in the 19th century as a matter of interest. The first interpretation is that Genesis 1 is a scientific textbook. And this has been around for, certainly in guise of scientific creationism, for around about 100 years. Henry Morris in the 1940s popularized scientific creationism by using certain scientific arguments to bolster a belief that if you read Genesis and you read it as scientific history and use the genealogies, you can date the universe to about 6,000 years old. Of course, this is very different from the picture of 13.7 or 13.8 billion years old. And scientific creationism, which has a great deal of theological and scientific integrity to it, therefore has to find itself asking the question, how does the timescale, generally accepted by most of modern science, fit with this interpretation of Genesis as a scientific textbook? And there are 2 options within scientific creationism for this. The first is simply to argue that in certain aspects modern science is wrong. It's got it wrong. And no doubt in the question time we might engage in some of this. I have to say that I speak as an astrophysicist rather than a biologist or a geologist or an expert in carbon dating or a whole number of different things of that sort. I have to say that the astronomical arguments I don't find terribly convincing for that. There is a second option, let me go back. And that came about in the 19th century. And that was the argument that maybe God made the universe old. An argument which goes, or was first coined with the phrase, did Adam have a navel? Just got to think about that for a moment or two. Did Adam have evidence of being born even though he wasn't born? And this argument was developed into saying, well, maybe God put the fossils into the rocks, or the light from that galaxy of 13.2 billion years ago set off, not from the galaxy itself, but on its way to Earth. It says that the universe was created all by God. In fact, it's a complete philosophical argument in that you can't argue against it. It's the type of argument that goes, the universe was made 30 seconds ago, and all of the memories of this lecture and all the boredom that you've endured is put into your minds 30 seconds ago. Well, I have to say, I'm not convinced by this myself. I think there are problems. First problem, which I'll come back to, is to say, is this really what the text is all about? And that's primary for me. Second is that I'm not convinced that the type of creation that we encounter within the scriptures has to be instantaneous. As in, I think, for instance, God talks about the creation of Israel, which takes time. It doesn't worry me that it may have taken God time to create something very beautiful, rather than producing instantaneous. I think it doesn't matter, his power is the same whether he does it instantaneous or over time. I do think that we've got to be careful in saying that modern science is wrong. We have to question modern science, don't get me wrong, that's the nature of science. It's our responsibility as scientists and Christians to say, does that work or not? But we have to weigh carefully how one or two arguments against fit with many arguments for. Now remember science, that no theory is ever perfect. What you get is an amount of evidence for and an amount of evidence against. You've got to weigh those two things together. You've got to do that carefully. And I don't buy the thing that God made the universe over, because I think Psalm 19, Romans 1, talk about although how we don't get saving knowledge of God, we do get something truthful in God's works. Second possibility then is what's sometimes called the gap theory, and this goes back to a 19th century thinker called Thomas Chalmers. And Chalmers, himself a scientist, was struggling with why, if I read Genesis, do I get a few thousand years, and science tells me a little longer than that in the 19th century, how do I keep the two together? And what Chalmers argued was that there was a gap between verse 1 and verse 2 of Genesis. He translated verse 2 as the earth became formless and empty. And so his argument was there was a perfect creation, then there was the fall of Satan, that was the gap. The earth became formless and empty, and God recreated them. So the first original creation could be billions of years ago, then God recreates just a few thousand years ago. And it's pretty neat, actually. If you've got an NIV version of the Bible, you notice there's a little footnote that still refers to that Chalmers interpretation of the gap theory. The trouble I have with it is, I have to say that I don't think that's a good translation of verse 2. And secondly, I don't think there's enough scriptural evidence for us to be clear that the fall of Satan had that kind of effect upon the universe. Third is the days equals ages of Hugh Miller, also in the 19th century. And Miller, in a way that has become, for many evangelicals, a fairly standard interpretation, says that in God's sight, a day can be a period of time or an age. Trouble is, I don't quite get that either, I have to say. Seems to be clearly in the writer's mind something about the days, which aren't just periods of time. Fourth, another neat interpretation. This comes actually from a little bit of the 20th century, a Roman Catholic priest called Hummelauer and an archaeologist called P.J. Wiseman, and that is that the days are days of revelation, not creation. And what they argued was that verse 1 should be translated, in the beginning God made known the heavens and the earth. And what you've got in Genesis is like a BGST seminar series for Adam. on the first chapter of Genesis. So God reveals a little bit on the first day, then he gives Adam a break, and then he reveals the next bit of creation on the second day. And so there's a week-long seminar for Adam. Day by day, as God talks about what he did. Again, it's very imaginative, but I don't think it quite works. You'll no doubt know by this stage that when speakers leave the last option, that's the option that they normally take themselves. And so let me be open and honest about this and say that for me, the fifth option begins with asking the question, what kind of literature is this? For me, the Bible is so important that I want to ask the question, how do I read it well? How do I read it in the way that it's meant to be read? Now, the trouble is, with Genesis 1, and partly why Christians have fallen out with each other, is it's really complex. It doesn't have any parallels. It's quite an intricate tapestry of lots of different things. There's poetry and history. There's theology, and there's liturgy or worship song. And if you want me to nail my colours on the mast, then let me do that. For me, I think Genesis is more of a hymn of worship than a scientific textbook. I think it's a hymn which says to us, I want you to get excited with who God is. And I want you not to just sit there intellectually approving, but I want to catch you up in a sense of worship of this wonderful Creator God. Now remember what I said at the beginning. I hope I've got enough humility to know that my interpretation may not be the correct one. It will vary with people in this room. And I want to be open and honest about that. But I hope we can agree that the most important thing is that the God we see in Jesus is the God who created the whole universe. He is without peer or competitor. He is the source of order. He's the sustainer and source of extravagance. And he seeks relationship with each one of us. I've gone on far too long. Forgive me. Is that all right to stop there? Thank you very much indeed.